For centuries, human beings have tried to answer one enormous question: where did we really come from? We built family trees, studied fossils, compared skulls, reconstructed migrations, and eventually learned to read the most intimate record our species carries, the genome. For years, scientists believed that as DNA technology improved, the human story would become simpler. Instead, it has become stranger. Modern humans did not evolve along one clean line, and our ancestors did not live in perfectly separated groups. They encountered other human populations, mixed with them, absorbed pieces of their genetic inheritance, and sometimes carried those fragments forward for hundreds of thousands of years. And now, in 2026, researchers using a new computational method called TRACE have identified evidence for two previously unknown archaic lineages in modern human ancestry. One contributed DNA to the ancestors of all living humans before the major expansion out of Africa. Another appears to represent an even older lineage that entered Denisovan ancestry before some of that DNA eventually reached modern humans. No complete genome from either population has ever been recovered. No confirmed fossil has been connected to either lineage. Yet their genetic footprints are here, and the deeper scientists look, the more the traditional human family tree begins to look less like a tree and more like a vast web. For most of the 20th century, the story of human evolution was presented as a relatively straightforward progression. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, expanded into the rest of the world, and eventually became the only surviving human species. Neanderthals occupied Europe and parts of Western Asia. Denisovans lived farther east. Other archaic populations disappeared. Modern humans survived and expanded. The picture was useful because it gave students and the public a simple framework. One species emerged, spread, and gradually replaced the others. But genetics started exposing cracks in that model. Sequencing Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes showed that modern humans did not merely encounter these populations and eliminate them. They interbred with them. Today, non-African populations generally carry around 2% Neanderthal ancestry, while some populations in Oceania and parts of Asia carry additional Denisovan ancestry. Suddenly, the human family tree was no longer a sequence of clean separations. It contained genetic bridges between populations that were supposed to have diverged. And once researchers accepted that interbreeding had happened more than once, another question became unavoidable. What if Neanderthals and Denisovans were not the only ancient human relatives who contributed DNA to us? What if the human genome contained traces of people whose fossils and genomes had not yet been identified? That possibility had been discussed for years, especially through statistical signals suggesting so-called ghost ancestry. But the evidence was difficult to map because scientists lacked genomes from the mysterious populations themselves. That problem is precisely what the new research attempted to solve. Researchers from the University of California, Berkeley, and collaborating institutions developed a computational framework called TRACE, short for Tracking Archaic Contributions via ARG Estimation. Instead of searching for a genetic match to a known Neanderthal or Denisovan genome, TRACE reconstructs ancestral recombination graphs, or genealogical maps, across the genomes of living people. Every chromosome contains a mixture of DNA segments inherited through different ancestral paths. Recombination breaks those segments apart and reshuffles them across generations, but the resulting patterns still preserve information about relationships far back in time. By reconstructing those genealogies across large numbers of modern human genomes, researchers can identify regions whose ancestry appears unexpectedly old. When a section of DNA traces back far beyond the age expected for ordinary modern human variation, scientists can ask whether it may have entered the human gene pool through ancient interbreeding. This approach is powerful because it does not require a fossil from the contributing population. The ghost can be inferred from the genetic trail it left behind. According to the Berkeley team, TRACE successfully recovered recognizable regions of Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry as a validation test, but it also identified additional ancient regions that could not be explained by either known archaic group. Those regions pointed toward two distinct sources of archaic ancestry. One was a lineage that researchers call a ghost ancestor. The other was even older and was described as a super-archaic lineage. The first discovery is remarkable because it appears to belong to the ancestry of humanity as a whole. Researchers found evidence that this ghost lineage contributed roughly 1% of the genomes of modern humans, and the signal appeared in both African and non-African populations. That tells scientists something extremely important about timing. The interbreeding event must have happened before the major population expansion that carried Homo sapiens out of Africa and into Eurasia, because both groups inherited comparable amounts of the ghost ancestry. The researchers estimate that the mysterious lineage diverged from the lineage leading toward modern humans around the same broad period when the ancestors of Neanderthals and Denisovans were separating, roughly 800,000 years ago. Yet the actual introgression into ancestors of modern humans occurred much later, more than 50,000 years ago, and likely around 300,000 years ago, according to the team's genealogical reconstruction. Those dates should not be confused with certainty about a particular ancient event. The researchers are inferring population history from DNA, not reading an ancient diary. But the implication is powerful. Long before modern humans expanded around the planet, our ancestors interacted with another archaic population inside Africa. That population has no confirmed name, no complete genome, and no directly identified fossil associated with the genetic signal. But part of its ancestry survived. The ghost became part of the ancestry carried by the population that eventually left Africa. Every later migration, therefore, carried some of that ancient inheritance forward. The second lineage is even older and more difficult to place. TRACE identified ancient ancestry within Denisovan-related segments found in modern Oceanian populations. These regions carried evidence of another source that was not simply Neanderthal or Denisovan. The Berkeley researchers described this as a super-archaic lineage descended from a population associated with a lineage roughly 8 million years old. The most likely interpretation is that Denisovan ancestors encountered this extremely ancient group somewhere in Eurasia, perhaps more than 200,000 years ago. Some of the super-archaic DNA then became part of the Denisovan genome, and later Denisovans interbred with Homo sapiens, passing a small amount of this extremely ancient ancestry into modern human populations. The key point is that the super-archaic contribution did not necessarily move directly from the million-year-old population into modern humans. It may have traveled through another archaic population first. This creates a remarkable genetic relay. An ancient lineage diverges, survives for an immense period, encounters Denisovan ancestors, contributes DNA to them, and then some of that ancestry eventually enters Homo sapiens. The scientists do not yet know exactly which hominin population was responsible. The divergence time overlaps with groups such as Homo erectus in Eurasia and other Middle Pleistocene populations. But the evidence is not sufficient to identify one species with confidence. That uncertainty is important. The discovery is strong evidence for hidden ancestry. War space. But it is not proof that a particular fossil species was the source. This is where the phrase ghost population can easily become misunderstood. A ghost population is not a supernatural group and not a civilization that vanished without a trace. It is a population whose existence is inferred because genetic data contain a pattern that cannot be explained without one or more unsampled ancestral groups. Scientists have used similar ideas in many areas of population genetics. If two known populations contain DNA that points toward a common ancestral source that has never been sampled, researchers can infer that an unknown population once existed. In human evolution, the problem is especially dramatic because ancient DNA is difficult to preserve over very long periods, particularly in Africa. Fossils may survive while their DNA degrades beyond recovery. A population may leave no known fossils at all. Even when a fossil is found, scientists may not have enough genetic material to sequence it. This means the fossil record is not a complete census of ancient humanity. TRACE offers another route. Instead of waiting to find the missing bones, researchers can search the genomes of living people for traces of ancestral populations that disappeared long ago. It is not the same as finding a fossil, but it can reveal that a population existed and participated in human evolution. The genome becomes a historical archive, preserving biological evidence even when the physical evidence is gone. The scale of the discovery is what makes it so important. The Berkeley researchers estimate that about 2% of the modern human genome overall can be attributed to archaic hominin ancestry when known Neanderthal and Denisovan contributions and these newly inferred lineages are considered. The ghost lineage alone contributes around 0.5 to 1% to an individual's genome, according to the study. That may sound small, but 1% of a human genome represents millions of DNA bases. More importantly, the ancestry is widespread. The ghost signal appears in African and non-African populations, meaning it is not a recent regional phenomenon. It represents an ancient contribution that entered the shared ancestry of living humanity before the major dispersal from Africa. This is what separates the finding from many famous examples of archaic admixture. Neanderthal ancestry is particularly associated with populations outside Africa because the major known interbreeding events occurred after some modern humans had already left Africa. Denisovan ancestry is unevenly distributed and especially prominent in Oceania and some Asian populations. The newly identified ghost lineage appears to have entered earlier, before the global population structure of modern humans emerged. The ancient event therefore became part of the common foundation from which later populations developed. It did not belong to one modern race or continent. It became part of us all. And this is where modern ideas of race become scientifically inadequate. Human populations are real in the sense that ancestry, geography, and demographic history create measurable patterns of genetic variation, but racial categories used in everyday society do not correspond to a small number of clean biological units. Human genetic variation overlaps. Populations have migrated. Groups have mixed. The same person can carry ancestry from multiple historical populations. The boundaries on modern maps are far too recent to define the entire genetic history of humanity. The ghost lineage makes that complexity even clearer. If an ancient population contributed DNA before the major expansion out of Africa, then that ancestry was carried into later populations that would eventually become Europeans, Asians, Indigenous Americans, and many other groups. The ancient contribution does not belong exclusively to any modern category. It belongs to the shared ancestry of humanity. This does not mean modern populations have no genetic differences. They clearly do. Allele frequencies vary, demographic histories differ, and local adaptations can be important. But the differences exist inside a much deeper network of shared ancestry. The genome does not draw the same lines that societies draw. It records reproduction and migration, not nationality. It remembers ancestors, not political borders, and it preserves genetic connections even when languages, cultures, and identities have changed completely. One of the most fascinating aspects of the TRACE findings is where some of this ghost ancestry appears. The Berkeley researchers report that ghost-derived segments can occur even in genomic regions where Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry is unusually rare. These regions had previously been treated as places where archaic ancestry was strongly suppressed, perhaps because natural selection removed archaic variants that were harmful in modern human genetic backgrounds. Discovering another archaic signal there complicates the story. It suggests that the absence of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA from a region does not automatically mean that the region is entirely free from archaic influence. A different ancient lineage may have entered the genome through a separate event and followed its own evolutionary path. This is scientifically fascinating, but it also requires caution. Finding ghost ancestry in or near a biologically important region does not demonstrate that the ghost population invented a human trait. It means that inherited DNA from the unknown population survives there and can now be studied. Researchers will need additional evidence before claiming that any particular ghost-derived segment influenced language, cognition, immunity, metabolism, or other complex traits. The exciting part is the opportunity for investigation, not a conclusion that the unknown population suddenly explains everything distinctive about modern humans. The immune system may eventually become one of the most important areas of investigation. The Berkeley team notes that many archaic segments are enriched in genomic regions associated with immunity and metabolic function. That pattern is not surprising from an evolutionary perspective. Humans repeatedly encountered new pathogens and new food sources as they moved into different environments. Interbreeding with other populations could introduce genetic variants that had already been tested by natural selection in those populations. Some of those variants might have been harmful, neutral, or beneficial. Natural selection could then increase the frequency of beneficial versions if they improved survival or reproduction. This is one reason archaic introgression can matter today. The DNA inherited from ancient populations is not necessarily biologically irrelevant. Some variants may influence immune responses or metabolism. Neanderthal-derived variants, for example, have been associated with aspects of immune function and susceptibility to certain diseases. Denisovan-derived variants include important adaptations in living populations. The new ghost lineages create another set of candidates. Scientists can now ask whether particular segments contributed useful functions or whether most simply survived as neutral remnants of ancient interbreeding. Either outcome would teach us something about evolution. The discovery also forces scientists to reconsider the timing of human interaction. For a long time, discussions of archaic admixture focused heavily on the period around 40,000 to 60,000 years ago, when modern humans were expanding into Eurasia and encountering Neanderthals and Denisovans. But if the new ghost lineage entered modern human ancestry around hundreds of thousands of years ago, then interbreeding was happening much earlier. Our ancestors were not waiting until the final migration out of Africa to encounter other human populations. They were already interacting with related groups deep in prehistory. This means Africa was likely a more complex evolutionary landscape than a simple picture of one homogeneous ancestral population suggests. Different human groups may have occupied overlapping regions, separated periodically by climate and geography, and then encountered one another again. The human lineage leading to Homo sapiens was therefore not isolated from other human relatives for most of its evolution. Contact may have been a recurring feature rather than a rare exception. That possibility fits into a broader transformation in evolutionary anthropology. The old metaphor of a family tree assumes that populations split and move into separate branches. Modern genomic evidence increasingly suggests a network or braided structure. Branches can separate, but they can also reconnect. A population can disappear while leaving genes in another population. A lineage can contribute DNA to another lineage and then vanish. Two groups can remain distinct for hundreds of thousands of years and still exchange genes when their descendants meet. This does not make evolutionary history random. Researchers can reconstruct many of these movements using population genetics. But it means the structure is more complicated than a ladder. Evolution is not a march toward modern humans. It is a history of populations repeatedly responding to climate, geography, competition, migration, and contact. Some branches survive, others end. Some return genetically through the descendants of their former neighbors. This is also why the word replacement can be misleading. Human populations sometimes expanded into regions where other groups lived and became genetically dominant, but replacement was rarely complete. A population could be reduced dramatically while still leaving descendants. Another could absorb newcomers without disappearing. In some cases, a small amount of ancestry from an ancient group survived despite the group itself becoming extinct as a distinct population. The ghost lineage is the ultimate example. Whatever population carried it may have disappeared completely as an identifiable group, but its DNA remained inside the expanding Homo sapiens population. Genetic history, therefore, contains many more survivors than the archaeological record might suggest. A population does not have to remain culturally visible to remain biologically present. The super-archaic lineage takes this idea even further. If the interpretation is correct, DNA from a lineage that diverged roughly 8 million years ago entered Denisovan ancestry and later reached modern humans through Denisovan admixture. That means genetic material can survive across immense evolutionary distances. The population that originally carried the DNA could have disappeared long before Homo sapiens became widespread. Denisovans themselves could later disappear as a distinct group, yet their genetic contribution survived inside modern humans, including DNA inherited from an even older population that had contributed to Denisovans. It is difficult to imagine a more complicated route for a piece of DNA to travel. A genetic variant can outlive the population that created it, then outlive the population that inherited it, and finally become part of a third population that never directly encountered the original source. Evolutionary inheritance can therefore travel indirectly through a chain of populations. The fact that researchers were able to reconstruct this history from modern genomes alone is one of the biggest technological achievements in the story. Ancient DNA remains enormously valuable, but it has limitations. The ancient record is geographically uneven. Cold environments preserve DNA better than hot and humid regions. Africa, despite being the cradle of our species, has comparatively limited ancient genome coverage from deep time because preservation conditions are difficult. TRACE works around part of this problem. It uses the genealogical information preserved in modern genomes to identify unusually ancient ancestry. This means that scientists can investigate populations whose fossils are missing or whose DNA has degraded. The approach does not replace ancient DNA. Instead, it creates a complementary tool. When a new fossil is eventually discovered, its genome could potentially confirm or clarify one of the ghost lineages. Until then, the genealogical signal provides evidence that something happened, and the future could be even more revealing. The Berkeley researchers explicitly say that adding genomes from more populations may reveal additional unknown lineages. This is particularly important for historically underrepresented populations in Africa and Asia. Human genomic databases are still uneven. Some groups have been studied intensely, while others remain barely represented. A new population can contain genetic variation that is invisible in existing datasets, and that variation may help identify ancient ancestry. The more globally diverse the database becomes, the more opportunities researchers will have to detect faint signals. That means the two ghost lineages reported in 2026 should not necessarily be treated as the final number. They are the first major discoveries produced by a method that is specifically designed to search for hidden ancestry. The scientists themselves expect that additional populations and deeper ancient genomes could reveal more. This is where the story becomes both exciting and humbling. We often imagine that the major discoveries of human evolution will come from archaeology. A new skeleton is found, a new cave is excavated, a new ancient genome is sequenced. Those discoveries are still crucial, but the next major breakthrough can also come from mathematics and computation. A new algorithm can reveal relationships hidden inside data that scientists already possessed. Trace did exactly that. The human genome did not suddenly acquire ghost DNA in 2026. It had been there for thousands of generations. What changed was our ability to recognize the pattern. This happens repeatedly in science. The evidence can exist for decades before technology provides a way to interpret it. The discovery is therefore not only about an ancient population, it is about the growing power of computational biology to reconstruct events that left no conventional record. And that brings us back to a question that has haunted anthropology for generations. How many human groups have we never discovered? The fossil record can answer only what survives and is found. Ancient DNA can answer only what preserves and can be extracted. Statistical genetics can infer populations that are missing from both, but even that tool has limits. There may be lineages that contributed so little DNA that their signals are currently undetectable. There may be ancient populations whose genetic material was completely lost. There may be fossils waiting beneath sediments that have never been excavated. There may be genomes buried in locations where preservation conditions are poor. The human evolutionary record is therefore necessarily incomplete. The surprising thing is not that gaps exist. The surprising thing is that modern technology is beginning to reveal some of them. The idea that every living human carries traces of unknown ancestors is also profoundly different from the old image of extinction. We normally think of an extinct population as completely gone. If no members survive, we assume the group has disappeared from the story. Genetics complicates that. A population can vanish as a community but survive inside another community's DNA. Its genetic material can persist even when every physical trace is gone. In this sense, extinction is not always absolute. A lineage may disappear as an independent population while continuing as fragments inside its descendants. Neanderthals are an obvious example. Denisovans are another. The new ghost lineage adds a third category, a population so poorly represented in the physical record that its existence is inferred almost entirely from the DNA of others. There is also something profoundly human about the way this changes our understanding of ancestry. People often imagine their ancestors as a long sequence of recognizable family members extending backward through history. Genetic ancestry is far stranger. Most of the people who contributed to our DNA have no names. They did not leave written records. They may not have belonged to civilizations that we know. Their languages are gone, their communities are gone, yet pieces of their biology remain. A tiny inherited sequence can survive for hundreds of thousands of years. The person who first carried that sequence might have lived in an environment completely unlike ours, surrounded by animals and landscapes that no longer exist. They could never have imagined a world with cities, computers, satellites, or genomic sequencing, yet their DNA is part of what allowed people to exist in that future. This realization also changes the meaning of human. The ghost and super-archaic populations were related closely enough to modern human ancestors to exchange genes. They were not necessarily Homo sapiens in the modern taxonomic sense, but the biological boundary was not absolute. Reproduction across lineages was possible. This supports reproduction across lineages was possible. This supports a growing picture in which ancient hominins were connected populations rather than sealed species boxes. Some differences between groups were large, but gene flow remained possible. The human evolutionary landscape was therefore populated by relatives that could recognize one another biologically even after long periods of separation. That does not erase the differences between species and populations, but it reminds us that evolution creates gradients and contact zones as well as boundaries. The discovery also cautions against the assumption that ancient DNA always tells us who a person was culturally. Genetics can reveal ancestry, but it cannot tell us everything about identity. A ghost lineage may have included people who differed culturally from our ancestors, but we have no direct evidence about their language, behavior, technology, or social organization. It is dangerous to take a genetic signal and fill the missing history with imagination. Scientists can infer population relationships. Archaeology and anthropology are needed to reconstruct behavior. Until fossils or other evidence are found, the ghost population remains genetically real but culturally unknown. That uncertainty is part of the scientific value. It tells us exactly where our knowledge ends. And perhaps the most surprising part of the entire story is that these discoveries do not make modern humans less special. They make our evolutionary history more remarkable. For decades, people imagined that Homo sapiens succeeded because we were a uniquely isolated species that replaced everyone else. The genomic evidence suggests a different explanation. We survived while repeatedly interacting with other populations. We absorbed useful variation. We adapted to new environments. We incorporated genes from relatives and carried them forward. Our success may have involved not only what we invented ourselves, but also what we inherited. Some biological innovations may have been introduced by other human groups and then preserved by natural selection. Evolution is not always a story of one population producing every useful trait independently. Sometimes adaptation is collaborative at the population level. You are carrying ancient encounters. You are carrying DNA inherited from people who lived before any modern nation existed. You are carrying fragments that may have come from populations whose fossil scientists have never found. You are carrying genetic history from Neanderthals or Denisovans, if your ancestry includes those contributions, and perhaps from deeper archaic groups that science has only just begun to identify. The genome is not a clean record of one lineage. It is a layered archive. Every chromosome contains pieces of different histories, some ancient, some relatively recent, some obvious, and some so faint that researchers need new mathematical tools to see them. That is why the 2026 TRACE study matters beyond the discovery of 2 ghost lineages. It demonstrates a new way of asking questions about evolution, instead of asking only, which fossil belongs to this population? The scientists can ask, what population must have existed to produce this genetic pattern? Instead of waiting for an ancient genome, they can reconstruct genealogical histories from modern people. Instead of assuming that the fossil record contains all relevant branches, they can search the genome for branches that have disappeared physically but survived statistically. This approach could transform studies of not only human evolution but other species as well. Priya Morjani and her colleagues have suggested that genealogical methods like TRACE may reveal hidden evolutionary histories across the tree of life. Of course, the method is not magic. Inference depends on models, assumptions, reference data, and statistical uncertainty. A genetic signal can have multiple possible explanations. Scientists must distinguish ancient introgression from incomplete lineage sorting, deep ancestral structure, mutation patterns, and technical artifacts. The identification of a ghost lineage is therefore strongest when multiple independent lines of evidence support it. TRACE provides a powerful framework, but the identity of the contributing populations remains uncertain. The researchers themselves point to future ancient genomes, additional modern populations, and potentially proteins recovered from Homo erectus fossils as ways of narrowing the possibilities. A scientific discovery can be revolutionary while still leaving major questions unanswered. In fact, the most important discoveries usually do exactly that. The next step may be to find the fossils. If researchers discover ancient remains whose genetic or protein evidence matches the inferred ghost lineage, the mystery could suddenly become much more concrete. Scientists could give the population a biological identity. They could reconstruct approximate geography. They could study physical characteristics and archaeology. They could ask whether the lineage was related to Homo erectus, another Middle Pleistocene group, or a population that is currently unknown. A single fossil could therefore turn a statistical ghost into a real historical population. But until that happens, the genetic evidence is already enough to establish that our ancestry contains contributions from populations that we cannot yet name. The story also reminds us that ancient human history was never a straight march toward modern civilization. For most of our existence, humans lived as small populations moving through changing environments. Climate cycles repeatedly expanded and contracted habitable regions. Ice sheets advanced and retreated. Rivers changed. Grasslands shifted. Forests expanded and disappeared. Populations were separated and reunited. A group could become isolated for thousands of years and then encounter distant relatives. These processes created countless opportunities for genetic exchange. The ghost lineages may simply be the latest evidence of a pattern that was happening repeatedly throughout prehistory. Think about the timeline. Our recorded history is only a few thousand years long. Agriculture is roughly 12,000 years old. Homo sapiens has existed for hundreds of thousands of years. The lineages detected by trace may reach back hundreds of thousands or more than 1,000,000 years. Most of the human story happened before anyone was keeping written records. It happened before cities, before states, before literature, before formal science. The genome is therefore one of the few surviving records capable of reaching so far back. It remembers a past that no civilization could document. And now, with the right mathematical tools, scientists can extract pieces of that memory. This also changes how we should think about extinction. The unknown ancestors may be gone as populations, but their DNA survived. That means the boundary between living and extinction is more complicated at the genetic level. A lineage can disappear from the landscape while remaining embedded in another lineage. A population can vanish while its descendants survive. Even a species that leaves no living representatives can contribute genes to another species, and thereby remain part of its evolutionary history. In that sense, the genetic past is never entirely dead. It continues inside the descendants of those who survived. And this is perhaps the most powerful final idea. The people from these ghost populations did not know that their genes would survive for hundreds of thousands of years. They lived ordinary lives in worlds that no longer exist. They may have hunted, gathered, traveled, raised children, faced disease, endured climate change, and watched generations come and go. At some point, descendants of their population encountered ancestors of ours. Genetic material crossed between them. Most of the traces eventually disappeared, but some survived. Those surviving segments crossed generation after generation through population movements and demographic bottlenecks until they reached people living today. The ghost does not live because its body survived. It lives because its history survived, and that history is written in us. The new discoveries, therefore, do not reveal one race that is different from all others. They reveal something far more profound. Every modern population is the product of countless ancestral encounters, and some of the people who contributed to us are still missing from the archaeological record. Human evolution was not a clean tree. It was a web of populations that separated, met, mixed, disappeared, and left traces behind. The old question was, who were our ancestors? The new question is much larger. How many ancestors are still waiting to be discovered? Because every new genome may reveal another branch, Every new fossil may identify another population. Every new computational method may uncover another ghost. And somewhere inside the billions of DNA letters carried by living humans, ancient sequences are still waiting to tell us what happened. Science has not finished mapping our family tree. It was discovered that the tree was never a tree. It was a website. And the strangest part is that some of the people woven into that web have no name, no fossils, no monuments, and no recorded memory. Their only remaining evidence is us. And perhaps that is the most astonishing discovery of all. We thought extinction meant disappearance. DNA says otherwise. We thought the past was gone. It was inside us. We thought the human story had one clean line. It had countless branches. Some survived, some vanished, some merged, and some became invisible until science finally learned how to see them. The ghosts were never outside the human story. They were part of it. They are part of us. And now, for the first time, we can finally begin to see them.